You ready, mate?
I'm ready.
Let's do
Excited.
it. Hello, and welcome to episode 52 of Great Things with Great Tech, the podcast highlighting companies doing great things with great technology. My name's Anthony Spiteri, and in this episode, we're talking to a company who develops a cost monitoring platform to help companies manage their Kubernetes resources and costs, providing direct integrations with the Kubernetes API and other billing APIs in the cloud, all to help clients reduce spend and prevent resource-based outages. They're currently sitting on a tick over $35 million in total seed plus Series A funding. That company is Kubecost, and I'm talking to Webb Brown, the co-founder and CEO at Kubecost. Welcome to the show, Webb.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Thanks for the great introduction. And yeah, pumped to get into it today. Excited
No worries.
for the chat.
Excellent. I might have prepared that earlier. So there you go. It's good when those always come off. Hey, mate, just before we get into everything about, Kubernetes and cost pressures and whatnot, I just want to put a shout out to the show. If you like great things with great tech and would like to feature in future episodes, you can click on the link on the show notes or head to gtwgt.com. All the episodes are up on the website. You can also obviously listen to this on YouTube or go to any podcasting platform, all distributed and hosted by Anchor.fm. All right, Webb, let's get straight into it because I feel like we're going to run out of time really quickly. We've got so much to cover around, what Kubecost is all about, around the Kubernetes costing and whatnot. Let's just start off by going through the history. A company that you founded with RJ Tripathi back in 2019. Maybe just go back, a bit of background about yourself, but also what kind of got you guys to start this company.
Yeah, we'll take it back to the beginning. Jay, and I like to say that Jay and I, in my views, I don't know if he agrees, but I very much feel this way, was very lucky to sit right next to Jay when I joined Google.
Wow.
We joined within a month of each other in 2013. And it was not soon after that we started talking about the idea of building stuff together. Jay was an infrastructure engineer. I was a product manager.
Right.
We just pretty quickly started talking about our love of creating and building new things. We were in a group where we were working on various like infrastructure monitoring like problems.
Yep.
In like kind of core Google infrastructure applications. Jay went on to Google Cloud. I went on to like a dev tools team after about a year and a half on a team together. And we were in this really cool spot where we saw several of my teammates join the Kubernetes effort really early on. And what we quickly saw was that early users of Kubernetes, especially those at scale, were having real challenges, even just getting basic visibility into spend.
Yeah.
Right. This old model of tagging VMs or tagging machines and allocating them back, or like charging them back to a particular department or team or project, et cetera, just really didn't work anymore.
No.
Because like in Kubernetes world, most things are multi-tenant, right? Like the Kubernetes scheduler is what is making these really complex decisions on where things run at any given time. So we felt, compelled to go and launch the Kubecost open source project in 2019, and kind of the rest is history. It's been an amazing adventure, and now have more than 5,000 teams running the product across a lot of different environments.
Isn't it awesome how like for you, it literally just became a case of you sat next to the right person, like when you started. That's the first sort of tick, right? I listened to another podcast that talks about history turning on knife points, right? And it's kind of that sort of thing with you sitting next to RJ, but also you guys were really there at the start of Kubernetes, effectively, right? Like before it was really a thing, and the project was, I guess, started inside Google. It's really cool that you guys were there, and straight away you saw that problem that needed to be solved. And I think you're absolutely right. The whole way in which Kubernetes overlays the old way. I won't say the old way because I still love the old way. The virtualization, the VMs, the actual machines. It's just so much harder to allocate cost because there's a lot more of a shared model with it, the microservice architecture, the way that, you know, resources are spun up and down dynamically, the way that you're relying on external, you know, resources as well. It could be a public cloud, it could be internal. You're right, there's a massive problem there. Interestingly enough, I'm just interested in your take before we dive into the open source side of things first, before we get into the Kubecost side, which is obviously related. You know, what's your take currently on the adoption of Kubernetes? Because to a certain extent, it's still kind of in this state of immaturity. There's complexity. Kubernetes at scale is still hard. So where do you see it today versus when you look to start this, you know, even what, 8 years ago now?
Yeah. So when we even just go back to the beginning of our company, I remember in our early kind of slides, if you will, it was, what is Kubernetes?
Yeah.
And then, you know, the question of like, will Kubernetes be a thing, right? There's a lot of different, you know, platforms to run like containers or orchestrate containers. And so it is mind blowing how far we've come as an ecosystem in terms of moving workloads and scheduling workloads in production environments on Kubernetes. I like to say that it feels like we're in, say, you know, inning number 3, you know, inning number 2 or 3, which is like, you know, we're not just starting. Like we see every day, like massive production Kubernetes deployments across basically every single vertical.
I was going to ask the verticals and where you
base.
see it. Yeah, because I think for my, yeah, go ahead. But I've got a bit of a outlook on that. But yeah, what's your thoughts there on the verticals?
I would say in general, it is much broader than I anticipated at this point in the like evolution of Kubernetes.
Yeah.
I would have thought that you know, we would have seen like a very heavy concentration in kind of you know, tech companies, you know, like growth stage companies that were like on the bleeding edge.
Yeah.
You know, in our user base, we have everything from like luxury retail to auto manufacturers to, you know, massive banks to healthcare, you name it. And I feel like we've seen it at this point. So it is much broader. And I think it's just representative of adoption of Kubernetes, right? Like we just see enterprises of all scales and all types, all industries adopting.
Yeah, and I guess when they're coming to you, they're using it more than just in a dev sense or a staging sense, right? Because, or, you know, just on a laptop. Because at that point, if they're coming to you to solve the problem, which is cost, then there's something tangible attached to that. It means there is an application, there is a workload that they do care about that is costing money, but then important to the business. But then how do they control that cost as well? So I think it just depends on who you talk to. And obviously you guys are at the coalface because, you know, there is that need for it. And your problem statement, I guess, is, you know, trying to resolve that overspend and cost issue within that ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. Like, and it's interesting even to see the evolution where we see this shifting early and earlier, which is, you know, go 2 years ago and it was pretty much 100% of teams that were coming to us had production workloads or were really close to production workloads in Kubernetes. Increasingly, we see platform engineering or DevOps teams that have kind of been there, done that, like seen some of the pain point of just having no visibility and the cost impact it can have. And they're pulling this for as like a core requirement before they stand up the platform. Yeah. So it's been interesting to see that, you know, evolution happen. And we view that as just more and more awareness of the problem and you know, having a cohort of, you know, like great engineering groups that have lived this kind of pain point before.
Yeah. I guess just before, I've got a good question to ask, but before that, I guess just from a point of view of, you know, what Kubecost is effectively, because I guess we haven't really, you know, laid that out for some of the listeners. Like, what is Kubecost? What it's trying to achieve? How does it relate to the open cost as well in your CNCF open source world? And then I've got a follow-up question we'll go back to after that. So let's go in reverse a little bit.
Yeah, great questions. For a lot of users, and I think of them like when we like meet at KubeCon, a lot of them see our name and they're like, let me guess what you do.
Yeah, I was going to make a joke. We talked about joking about, you know, usually ask people about the name and how you came to it, but it's blazingly obvious. So yeah, we won't go down that path.
Yeah, it reflects that we are a transparent team and, you know, like pretty literal with our naming. So we build, you know, cost management platform for teams running cloud native or Kubernetes. So what we do is kind of three parts. We give teams great visibility into their spend on Kubernetes and then related services. So if you're using, say, like external services like S3 or RDS, et cetera, from a Kubernetes tenant, and then we give insights into how to optimize infrastructure and like applications on top of it. So the goal here would be to help each, like organization or team find the right balance between cost and reliability or cost and performance.
Yeah.
And then lastly, we give teams kind of governance solutions. You can think like budgets and policies and spend alerts, all these things available in real time to help team just kind of put some guardrails on spend and spend over time as their infrastructure and platform evolves and changes.
Yeah, and just in terms of I'm interested in the actual teams. Like you're using teams a lot. So what's your definition of a team? I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, it can vary, but we are typically working with like a platform or DevOps team
Yep.
that is like managing that infrastructure, that Kubernetes infrastructure, whether it's like, on-prem, Kubecost runs on-prem, even like in air-gapped environments, or a managed, like EKS, AKS, GKE, et cetera.
Yeah.
So we would typically view them as like, they're our core group that we typically start working with. Often from there, they'll share this data or insights with finance or application engineering or, like executive management teams. So other teams will get brought in, but it's oftentimes that core like DevOps team that we typically find will install Kubecost or OpenCost first.
Because they're the ones that typically are the ones that will blow out spend traditionally and kind of do their own thing. I've obviously working in service providers, working within platforms and working with developers almost all my career. I know how gung-ho they can be at times, right? And to them, cost isn't front of mind, never is, because they just want to get the application out. They want to write it where they want to write it, put it where they want to put it, consume what they consume. So and that kind of lends itself to the patterns of overspend. Like I've seen you talk about this before, which I thought was a really interesting, tie into Kubecost and what you guys see, because you're kind of defining 5 patterns of overspend being orphaned resources, abandoned workloads, rogue deployments, which is kind of what I was talking about, the rogue developer doing what they want to do, leveraging incorrect usage types, and over provisioning. Actually, when I see all of these, I just blame the developer overall for them not understanding. As an infrastructure platform guy, I kind of, it irks me a bit, but this is what we're doing. We're trying to kind of make them aware of where their spend is, and Kubecost is putting that front and center, like you said, making them aware first, and then literally getting that information to the people that are making the decisions, above them in terms of the operators and owners.
Yeah. So like as an engineer or former engineer myself, I know that as an engineering team, you've got a million things to think about, right? And we view it, just like you mentioned first, which is like, first and foremost, it's about, shipping products and making sure they're reliable and doing things to like, create value for your users and, your company, et cetera. Our view is that we just want to try to reduce the friction and make it, that much more accessible to say, what does this application cost? And is that the right balance between, excess capacity or slack capacity and the costs associated with it versus, the risk of having, too little capacity and then, having performance degradation, or outages potentially. So we just view it as like we're, there to create that visibility as step one. And we think that's like a critical step to actually getting to like efficient or optimized infrastructure. If there's one metric that we recommend teams start with to like on their journey to like optimize infrastructure is a notion of cost efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, of every dollar that you're spending on your environment, where that's like, paying a cloud provider or, amortization on like an on-prem, infrastructure, what percentage of that dollar are you actually utilizing, right? So like any given point, like, $1 of RAM, what are you utilizing? A CPU core, a GPU core, disk, et cetera, et cetera. If you just roll that up into one number for a cluster, it can be like incredibly telling at a very high level. And then from there, you can dig into, like you said, I can go and like optimize application level, things. I can optimize things at the orchestration level. I can optimize things at the infrastructure level, like node size, instance type, like, the way node pools are allocated, scale up, scale down, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in total, we've got 16 different insights in our product today, touching on just what you mentioned and more. But we always try to help teams get great visibility first, because we oftentimes see that as the first step of just transparency throughout the organization, and ultimately like some level of ownership to say that when cost goes up, teams are aware of it, and like increasingly it's on their radar, and they can take action.
Yeah, I mean, I've installed and played with it, like I said, and even I installed it on my little server that's sitting right next to me here, just on my little Kube cluster that I've got, right, and it gave me some really interesting insights. Just I love looking. I've always loved the capacity planning side of it. I used to manage a platform for that. This would have been awesome in that level. I always love the graphs, trying to attach a cost to it. So that's my way of thinking. So I love seeing it. I know that developers traditionally don't see it that way, which is why you get this almost, I won't say it's a lack of understanding, but like you said, they're all about just getting the application. That's their primary task. How can I deliver this application? I don't really care if I've left an IP address sitting there, and reused one. The Elastic IP is still there. It's going to cost $2 a month. Who cares? Put that over 5 years, times that by 10. That's quite, it all adds up, right? So how do you think it's, because I always think that this was always a thing, even back in the day, if you were running a cloud platform on premises, you had to understand costs, and it was generally driven down to CPU, memory, storage, networking. You're obviously going in a lot more granular, aren't you? And in today's public cloud world, like you said, you've got 15, 16 metrics there that help, monitor the costs. Is it just something that's naturally evolved over time because of what we're seeing, or is it just same?
Yeah, I think with the transition to distributed computing and containers, like infrastructure and applications are getting more complex, right? So fundamentally, we believe, new tools are needed, and new like visibility and new insights are required. But if you look at a lot of the like core principles of, you want, if a team is spending significant amount of resources, you generally want them to be aware of what they're spending, right? And, some level of accountability may be a good thing, right? Generally having like governance solutions to where if they expect to send a certain amount and they end up spending, 5x that, they should ideally be aware, really quickly. I think a lot of those core concepts are the same, but the abstractions we're using, like Kubernetes auto scaling, the actual like implementation using Helm, where you can take our product and install it in seconds, like all those we view are being rethought, with the like mass adoption of Kubernetes and distributed computing more broadly.
Yeah, and actually, to be fair, like when you talk about the ease of install, like Helm just one sort of command line and installs it within a couple of minutes, deploys all the microservices, the pods, and gets it up and running. That's kind of almost part of the problem with Kubernetes as well, is that you can just install stuff so easy, like literally, and you don't know what's like, unless you got an understanding of what's being deployed in the microservices, what's this pod doing, what other elements is it using? Is it using any security? Is it using a load balance IP address? So I feel like there's a lot of let's just install it because we can get it off Google, copy paste, and we're doing it. I think that's part of the problem that we're trying to solve here with cost and overspend, because these resources can be consumed at scale. And if you look at the cost, I think I looked at it last night, the cost of running an EKS cluster, in theory over a year, if you kind of let it going, it ain't cheap. Like we're talking tens of thousands of dollars per year for a basic cluster. So if you just let that purr around the background, you're going to have to answer at some point to somebody who goes, hey, this bill is not looking great. How do we solve it?
Yeah. Again, I think this all kind of starts with that just awareness, right? And I do think that you've seen just such massive growth of the cloud as well as Kubernetes, and also just kind of changing macroeconomic environment, if you will, where all of a sudden a lot of teams are saying, wow, we're spending a significant amount here, and we just want to be aware and get our arms around what we're spending. And what you typically see here is when teams are lacking visibility, the answer is, well, you just over provision, right? Because let's say you don't know if you need, one CPU or two CPUs for an application. Well, you just get 5 because you don't want to be CPU throttled.
Yeah.
Right. And if you don't know the cost of those CPUs and you're not sure if that's another, $100 a year or $10,000 a year, it's easy to just do the over provisioning.
Yeah.
But once you have that visibility and the insights to allow you to kind of dial that in more effectively, and you can weigh the probability risk of CPU throttling versus the actual dollar cost, it empowers teams to make those decisions much more thoughtfully, right? And again, maybe when you're early to Kubernetes, it's okay to run really inefficiently because it costs your organization an extra, say, $2,000, and global expenses for your company are $10 billion, right?
Yeah.
And so it may it will ultimately empower teams to take the actions that are right for them at their stage of adoption and journey, to being fully production Kubernetes.
Yeah, and I had a flashback as you were talking about the reality of the cost pressures today and just the change in metrics and the way that we've all become a lot better at understanding exactly what things cost. I had a thought back to when I moved data centers. This must have been, now I'm going back, right? Showing a little bit of my age, but about 2005-06, we moved to data centers. And I remember going into this new data center, we just stacked our racks. We had the power, but we didn't have power to the racks. So what I did literally, I lifted up the floor, I looked underneath, and I just grabbed random power. Can you believe it today, right? It wouldn't happen. I grabbed these random power cords, these 3-phase cords, and plugged it in, and that was it. And we had power because there was no notion of understanding that power costs money. Running these systems, they all run hot. If you produce heat, you're costing money, right? Like that's the whole point of CPU. And like if you're running these things hot, they cost money. But then obviously very quickly over time, 2005 to 2010, the reality was we had to start, understanding exactly how much these racks cost, how much, if we were putting in a new rack of storage, could we fit it within the kilowatt allowance in the rack? So this is without question an evolution of what we did, but it's just doing it differently because now more people are consuming cloud in this way. The APIs, the microservices, it's just an evolution. And you're obviously filling that spot. I just had that flashback. I don't know why. And I thought it just tied in nicely, and maybe the older people who are listening can understand that.
Absolutely. I think it is an evolution of that. And then once you have that visibility, how do you really, optimize this equation again against cost and performance? And I think actually what you just shared, Anthony, is touches on what you mentioned earlier with OpenCost, which is OpenCost is now a CNCF project, fully open source project, to bring this common language of cost to anybody else that wants to build on top of it.
Yeah.
So the AWS team just launched a really cool integration on top of this, which actually integrates with Kubecost, which again is fully built on top of OpenCost. But what this is trying to do is create just a common spec, a common language across any environment to where you can say, here is the cost of a container. And once you have a cost of a container, then you can roll up and say the cost of a namespace or a label or set of labels or annotation or microservice, et cetera, et cetera. But it's different than, again, the previous generation of VM costing, because the cloud providers themselves don't have an actual source of truth per se. They have to look into the Kubernetes scheduler, the kubelet, to actually see, okay, what is this container or this microservice actually consuming? And which set of nodes is it consuming those resources on? And what are the costs of resources on those nodes? And kind of roll those up and do it in a sense that's really dynamic, because these things are constantly changing in Kubernetes environments. So again, I think it's really, like you said, it's an evolution of that same problem, kind of done with open source in a way that's trying to create a common language or a standard across a very diverse group of
Yeah.
Kubernetes environments.
So let's talk about the open source side of it, the CNCF project, like you mentioned and touched on, because I noticed, like looking through your history, 2009, the open source project launched that you were running, but then obviously in June 2022, Opencost launched as well. So what's the differential there between what you were doing in 2019 versus what you've launched Opencost.io this year?
Yeah, great question. If you look at the original Kubecost open source project, it was just kind of this bare bones, basic, really basic cost visibility. It kind of plugged into Prometheus, so you could get like time series data on cost, right? And you would query Prometheus. You can like, use Alert Manager to like look at cost metrics. Now, if you look at Opencost, it is this full like cost allocation engine, to where you can build models up and say, give me cost by namespace of the last, 7 days,
Okay.
cost by label, app over the like last, 90 days, et cetera, et cetera. It ships with a basic UI that users can use. All of that's available like outside of the box. So, if you look at that evolution, we've taken the original Kubecost open source project, we've committed it to Opencost. We've added a bunch of things, since we originally launched it.
Yep.
And then we've also, with a great group of partners, including, Red Hat and GCP and AWS and a number of others, to build a true spec around that model, so that, again, teams can see from the ground up how we've thought about the methodology for actually calculating costs in Kubernetes environments.
Right. So Opencost.io is that project where you go to.
Exactly.
And then effectively you install it. It's got all the installation sort of instructions on that site. And then it's got, I'm assuming out of the box, it's like Kubecost, it's got some basic, modeling that you can do. How do you actually then model it? Like what type of persona would be doing that modeling? Is it easy to do? I mean, you mentioned the basic UI. How easy is it to basically, mold and create those additional modeling sources?
Yeah, for most teams, you can get up and running in minutes and answer the common questions of, again, cost by cluster, cost by namespace, cost by service, cost by annotation, cost by deployment or stateful set or job, like you name it. And that is kind of like pre-canned out of the box. You can come in and configure that for different time windows. You can also do some more configuration of like, if you have shared services, how you allocate those across team. If you have like idle costs, how you allocate that across team. So this is all meant to like give you a bunch of functionality out of the box where you can, do like run a bunch of powerful reports. If you then want to like do, more powerful, like take this data and transform it in other ways, everything is backed by an API.
Yep.
In the UI. So you can, query these APIs, whether it's like allocation data or underlying assets data. So yeah, the goal is to like, kind of tackle the 90% plus use cases out of the box with like, a UI that's really easy to use. And then for more advanced use cases, there's these APIs where you can take it and, do any number of things with it.
Yeah, the smart people can get into it and start to do smart things with the APIs. And okay, that's really cool. So I think I love, this is one thing about the open source and CNCF, landscape that I love. I mean, I looked at the foundation, it's grown, like the actual website with all the projects there. It's crazy. And that actual site has become very functional. I love what they've done with it. And they had to do something because it used to like chug your computer when you used to load it up. And if you ever tried to load the PDF, it would just take forever. That aside, I think it's great that you've kind of taken that open source, path, but still been able to build Kubecost on top of that, building on the basis of that, multiple projects, and then offer some commercialized incentives for people to run Kubecost, right? Because in terms of your planning structure, you've got a free forever, which is a certain set of capabilities, and then you run a mid-tier, and then you've got like basically a higher tier. But maybe just explain how that works and where you see the majority of people starting, and do they go to the next tier, and where do you see that going?
Yeah, so we've got thousands and thousands of teams running either like pure open source or that free tier. And it's meant to be, again, always free, useful for teams that are smaller or even mid-size, but don't have the complexity of, say, like a large enterprise where you have to do, say, RBAC or, use SSO or SAML or, any like complex kind of like organizational needs like that. So we've got, tons of teams that run that. And then we have, hundreds of teams that have upgraded to more like, enterprise license where they do need those like, more complex features.
Yeah.
That fits with our model is like, we want to build tools that are free and useful for like tens of thousands of teams. And for those small teams that want more support, or small number of teams, excuse me, that want support, training, those complex enterprise features because they have like, multi-cloud or hybrid cloud or many different clusters across different regions, and they want to see it all in a single pane of glass. We have those versions available. And yeah, I think that just fits with our view on like starting with open source. Everything is kind of by default built for our free tier. And then it's only if it's like very compelling, really just for larger enterprises that we tend to move it to like our enterprise tier.
Yeah.
And it's allowed us to again work with thousands and thousands of teams and help them on a problem or a problem space that we find absolutely fascinating, and it's felt like a dream come true.
Well, yeah, I mean, just the funding alone would dictate the success and the interest there, right? Like, I think that's always a good indication of where you're at if people are willing to invest in your idea and in your vision. So, yeah, absolutely, you're doing the right thing. And then obviously at some point, yeah, there's commercial aspects to it. But if you keep yourself true at heart for the mission statement, that's actually so important because it means that you're kind of there and you believe in what you're doing as opposed to just being in it for the sake of a outcome, basically, right?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, we say we're here to help people first, and we very much hope to build a sustainable business so that we can help more and more people over time. But it starts with helping people, and that's independent of being paid to help,
which is very good. Like let's not mince words. That's a good thing. But there's other things that actually are important in this ecosystem as well.
Yeah, I mean, and we think it just works well with this ecosystem more broadly. Like your mention of open costs, because of the CNCF ecosystem, where it's generally been really easy to align with projects like Prometheus and Thanos and others, and have ours like essentially be built on top of it. That like openness and like common data standards and just general interoperability, we think is incredibly valuable for ultimately helping users solve problems end to end in enterprises where like you see a lot of different needs, right? Where data needs to live and data compliance needs, et cetera. So we think that's just key to like building great end-to-end solutions that work in the modern enterprise.
Yeah, cool. I've got a few more things before we finish up, a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to talk about the AWS partnership that you kind of just announced. It's really cool, really exciting. It's on the AWS marketplace. If you search there, it lists, the fact that you can obviously tie in very closely with EKS and the out of cluster costs as well. So, effectively monitor spend on S3, RDS, DynamoDB and whatnot. But there's more to it, isn't there? Like what's the additional benefit that those customers are getting if they buy it through the marketplace in the partnership with AWS?
Yeah, and there's actually a couple of different parts to this. I would say the biggest one that we just launched, which we think is really, really exciting, which is cost monitoring for EKS. And that is a partnership with the EKS team where you can take a kind of EKS optimized version of Kubecost. You can deploy it on any Kubecost cluster, any EKS cluster for free, within minutes, if not seconds. That is coming with like a Helm chart that's optimized for EKS.
Cool.
Again, it's coming with like unlimited free capabilities across any EKS cluster. And then it's coming with support from the AWS team. So if you have support lines with AWS. So we're really excited by the partnership. And and feel like there's a lot more we can help to get teams great visibility and insights on the EKS platform.
Yeah. And I guess that the other thing I wanted to highlight was, again, like I've installed it locally on my own cluster. This is obviously my test dev, which I muck around in, try and work out the crazy world of Kubernetes. But then, there's other, obviously, people out there, like we see the proliferation of OpenShift out there. So on-prem Kubernetes is obviously a real thing. So in your balance, or the way that you kind of set up the way that you look at future enhancements or versions, how do you balance that out, knowing that the world today is kind of hybrid, and a Kubernetes cluster is as likely to be on-prem moving forward as it is in the public cloud?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it speaks to like how we actually architected the product from day one. So Kubecost as well as OpenCost can run in any on-prem Kubernetes cluster from the last, I think now close to 3 years, or 2.5 years. You don't have to egress any data, to any kind of like Kubecost service or anything like that. You can take it and again, Helm install it, whether it's like you use a storage bucket that's accessible locally in an air-gapped environment, or just pull it from our repos. So we wanted to architect for that day one to just have a fully self-managed deployed version, again, kind of like a Prometheus or Grafana, to just let users own and control their own data and their own experience. If you look at our user base today, about 25% of it is estimated to be on-prem. So it is
that's a big number. That's bigger than I would have thought, actually. There you go. Interesting.
Same. And I think what we've seen anecdotally is that like a lot of users are onboarding to like EKS and managed platforms, and that number is generally growing really quickly. But there's also just this massive footprint of like on-prem clusters that and just like infrastructure in general that's out there and is still getting a lot of investments and is not going away anytime soon.
Good point. Yeah, there you go. Hey, and the final questions are kind of slightly controversial one, and I did prep you for this just to make sure that it was okay to ask. Do you foresee a time in the future where this cost issue, because of the complexity and the relative immaturity of Kubernetes public cloud, ever goes away or is under control? Or are we always going to have this problem because of the nature of where distributed computing is going?
Yeah, so it is, it's our mission to make it go away. And by that, I mean, with OpenCost and purely open source solutions, we want this data to be available to everybody, right? Like, just like we think about it as like, for most, platforms, getting, say, CPU utilization data is kind of, not entirely, but like most users think of it as a solved problem, right? Like we think cost visibility or cost observability can go to a very similar place.
Yeah.
And that's what we're focused on doing. We, want to do everything we can to support teams to like build on top of OpenCost, integrate with OpenCost, et cetera. We think we can do a lot more of the like training and again, building kind of enterprise guardrails and things on top of these metrics that we think are really important and will be really valuable for a long time to come. The reason we believe that is that we think that's an intersection of like technical complexity and just like organizational or behavioral complexity, right? Awesome. And we think that like the intersection of that in large enterprises isn't necessarily going to be solved tomorrow. But again, we want to do everything we can to solve that for everybody with these open source solutions.
Fantastic. That's a great way to finish. We've got about 30 seconds left. So that was really good. I really wanted to ask that question. You guys are doing an amazing thing. You're obviously successful. You've hit that right problem statement. You've hit the market well. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys do in the future. So, thanks, Webb, for being on. Just as a reminder, if you aren't subscribed or you're new to the show, please go to gtwgt.com. Hit the subscribe button. You can catch up on all future episodes. And with that, I'd like to thank Webb and Kubecost, and we'll see you next time on Great Things with Great Tech.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
Perfect timing.